The seventh-floor maintenance room of the Alcamar Grand Hotel was nothing like the opulent lobby below. There were no gold inlays, no perfumed air, no champagne flutes clinking behind glass. Here, there were wires, toolboxes, old circuit boards, and the soft hum of machines that no one ever thought about, until they stopped working. Jake Sullivan liked it that way. At 37, Jake had the quiet presence of a man who had seen too much, but wore none of it on his face. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the posture of someone still half in uniform, he moved through the hotel's back corridors with silent precision. Most of the staff barely registered him, just the American technician, always polite, always early, never in the way. That's how he wanted it. Jake kept a worn leather notebook in the front pocket of his uniform shirt. He checked it often, not for schematics or repair logs, but for something more precious. Arabic proverbs, idioms, lullabies, and fragments of folk tales, carefully transcribed, word by word, line by line. It was the language his wife, Lena, had once whispered into his ear and into their daughter's heart. It was the only piece of her he could still carry. He never let anyone see it. Most nights, after his shift ended and the hotel's glamour dimmed into silence, Jake would return to his modest room in the employee quarters. He'd sit on the edge of the single bed, pull out his phone, and wait for it to ring. "Daddy." Lily's voice always arrived like sunlight in winter. "Hey, sweet pea," he'd say, softening. "Ready for tonight's story?" "Arabic, please." She always asked. She always said, "Please." And so, with his notebook open and the bedside lamp casting a warm pool of light, Jake would speak, his voice low, soothing, deliberate. He translated as he read, pausing to explain the tricky parts, mimicking voices for characters he'd never seen, but knew by heart. Through a screen and across oceans, he built a little world for his daughter, where a talking fox outsmarted a greedy sultan and a desert girl planted hope in a dying orchard. Lily giggled. Sometimes she asked questions. Sometimes she just listened. On those nights, Jake felt almost whole. That morning, Dubai was already breathing fire by 9 a.m. The sun glanced off every mirrored panel of the hotel's glass facade. Inside, the lobby glittered. Marble floors polished like water, orchids flown in from Thailand, chandeliers heavy with Austrian crystal. The kind of place where royalty stayed, where nothing was out of reach, except, perhaps, honesty. Jake was crouched beneath the central speaker array, tuning the audio levels for a private event that hadn't yet been disclosed to staff. His tool belt clinked gently as he moved, methodical, unnoticed. "Excuse me," came a clipped voice. A tall man in a sharp grey suit, probably a manager from another department, gestured toward Jake like he was pointing at a smudge on the wall. "Do you have to do that here, now?" Jake didn't flinch. "Yes, sir. The client requested a suite before the meeting." The man looked unimpressed. "Try not to be seen." Jake offered a half nod. He was used to that. He tucked his notebook deeper into his pocket and refocused on the soundboard. One of the volume regulators was glitching. It hissed every time the microphone went silent. He adjusted it with gentle fingers, like a medic dressing a wound. 2 floors up, a woman in heels barked orders at interns who scurried across the ballroom like mice. Rumor had it that Sheikh Abdul Rahman himself was arriving this afternoon, one of the wealthiest oil magnates in the region. Powerful, influential, and particular. The staff was buzzing, every department tightening bolts and smoothing sheets, afraid that a fingerprint out of place could cost them a contract or a career. Jake didn't care for the politics. His world was wires and circuits, not titles and handshakes. But as a former military linguist, he couldn't help noticing the languages being tossed around as security teams and foreign dignitaries arrived. Arabic, English, some Turkish. a little farcy. There was a rhythm to it, one that brought back memories he didn't often let himself revisit, the kind where mistakes meant casualties, where a single mistranslated word could cost lives. Jake stood up and stretched his back, his joints cracked. He wasn't old, but war-aged men unevenly. He glanced at the time. 6:42 p.m. Almost time. He packed up his tools, wiped his hands on a cloth, and took the stairs back down to his quarters. His room was small, barely enough space for a bed, a chair, and a foldable desk. But it was clean. Simple. The only decoration on the wall was a framed photo of Lena, laughing under a fig tree, wind in her hair. Jake sat, opened his notebook, and called, "Daddy." "Hey, Peanut." She was wrapped in a blanket, hair messy from the day, her face glowing in the dim light of her bedside lamp. "Story time," he smiled. "Tonight I've got a new one. It's about a girl who tricks a greedy merchant into planting a forest in the middle of the desert. Does she win?" Jake looked at Lena's photo. "She always does." And then he began, in Arabic, his voice steady, kind. Each word, each pause, was not just a story. It was a promise that no matter how far apart they were, her father would always find her, in language, in memory, and love. The air inside the Al-Kamar Grand Hotel had changed. It wasn't the scent of jasmine sprayed hourly from hidden dispensers, or the chill of the over-conditioned air whispering through the marbled halls. It was subtler than that, a shift in pressure, in posture. People stood straighter, voices dropped lower. The staff moved with surgical precision, as if one wrong glance could cost them everything. Sheikh Abdul Rahman was arriving. To most, he was just a name on a headline. Oil magnate, regional power broker, a man with enough wealth to buy silence in 3 languages. But to the management of Al-Kamar, he was something closer to a deity. His presence meant international attention, billion-dollar deals, and, for those who played their cards right, a possible ticket out of the service industry. Jake Sullivan adjusted the focus on his multimeter and continued his diagnostics. He was in the East Wing control room, deep in the hotel's bowels, rewiring a faulty breaker that kept overloading the audio feed to the Grand Salon, the same ballroom where the Sheikh's private council would be meeting within the hour. A fire hazard if left unchecked, a quiet disaster waiting to happen. "Jake." The voice came from behind, clipped and strained. It belonged to Kieran, the hotel's assistant director of operations. 30, ambitious, hair always too perfect. He wore his suit like armor and his insecurity like perfume. Jake didn't look up. "I'll be done in 20. Kieran stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You need to be gone before the Sheikh arrives." Jake pulled the wire from its terminal, inspecting the frayed edge. "Electrical's not finished. If the breaker trips during the meeting, we lose half the speakers and the media feed. Could take the lights too." "Then work faster," Kieran hissed, casting a quick glance toward the door. "This isn't about safety. It's about image. We don't want anyone visible who doesn't fit the look we're presenting." Jake finally looked up, his face calm, unreadable. "You mean someone in a uniform," he said. "I mean someone who looks like they belong in the basement, not on the mezzanine," Kieran snapped, instantly regretting his tone, but not enough to apologize. "We've got diplomats, sheikhs, security contractors from 3 continents." Jake cut the power to the box, rewired it in silence, then flipped the breaker back on with a quiet click. The control panel came alive. No sparks, no hiss. Stable. "You're good to go," Jake said simply. Then, without another word, he gathered his tools and stood. Kieran cleared his throat awkwardly, gesturing toward the staff service corridor. "Take the rear elevators. Avoid the lobby." Jake gave a slow nod, the hint of a smile playing at the edge of his lips. Not bitterness, not resentment, just quiet understanding. The lobby shimmered under the glow of chandeliers larger than small cars. At least 3 event coordinators paced in nervous loops, clutching earpieces and clipboards, whispering into radios. Bellboys lined the entrance like soldiers awaiting inspection. Security men, tall and silent in dark suits, flanked the revolving doors. Then the convoy arrived. 6 black vehicles. Sleek. Unmarked. The kind that didn't just suggest importance, they demanded it. Sheikh Abdul Rahman emerged from the center vehicle. Dressed in white robes trimmed with gold, he carried himself not with arrogance, but certainty, as if the space around him simply arranged itself to his preference. He walked with the calm gravity of a man whose time was too valuable to be wasted, even by history. Jake had paused at the mezzanine, tools slung over one shoulder, caught in the flow of the crowd. He knew he should have turned into the staff corridor, but something made him linger. Perhaps curiosity, or maybe just the human instinct to see power up close, if only for a moment. He didn't expect to be noticed. But one of the Sheikh's aides, a younger man with slicked back hair and a hard stare, locked eyes with Jake for a beat too long. His gaze traveled down Jake's faded uniform, lingering on the worn knees and scratched name tag. Disapproval radiated from him like heat. "Who is that?" the aide muttered, not even bothering to lower his voice. A nearby concierge, eager, flustered, answered in a hurry. "Maintenance, sir. He'll be gone shortly." The aide narrowed his eyes. "He shouldn't be in view. Have him removed." Jake didn't flinch when the request was relayed to him. A security guard walked over, apologetic but firm. "Sorry, Mr. Sullivan. They'd prefer you not be here during the arrival, just for today." Jake nodded once, no argument. He descended the rear staircase, one hand resting on the worn notebook in his shirt pocket. He had memorized every line by now, but the act of carrying it was a comfort, like a soldier polishing medals he never displayed. As he passed the back entrance to the Grand Salon, he paused. From behind the gilded doors, he heard the distant buzz of diplomatic chatter, the shuffle of tailored suits, the clink of ceremonial glasses. None of it belonged to him. And yet, in the language floating just beyond those walls, Arabic, melodic and formal, Jake heard Lena's voice. Not literally, of course, but in the cadence, in the rise and fall of the phrases, in the way words danced with dignity. He stepped away. That night, back in his room, he sat once more under the dim glow of his desk lamp. Lily's voice filled the space like music. "Daddy, were you working when the king arrived?" "He's not a king, sweetheart," Jake said, chuckling softly. "Just a man who wears fancier clothes than I do. Did you meet him?" "No," Jake replied, his voice gentler now. "But I heard the way he spoke. It reminded me of your mom." Lily grew quiet. Then, in a small voice, she asked, "Can I hear one of her stories again?" Jake opened the notebook, and in a language not his own, but made his by love, he began to speak. The Grand Salon had been transformed overnight. Velvet drapes in deep burgundy covered the walls. Mahogany tables gleamed beneath soft golden lighting. A long conference table ran the length of the room, set with crystal water glasses, platinum pens, and monogrammed leather portfolios. The carpet was so thick it muffled even the sharpest heel clicks. This was no public event. There were no name tags, no press, no applause. Just a dozen powerful men and one woman, gathered for a meeting that didn't officially exist. The kind of meeting where borders shifted and maps were redrawn with a single nod. Jake Sullivan crouched beneath the audio console at the back of the room, adjusting a receiver frequency. The head technician had called in sick, and Jake had been asked, reluctantly by Kieran, to step in, as long as he remained unobtrusive. No one in the room noticed him. He liked it that way. Above, mounted into the chandeliered ceiling, were directional microphones, state-of-the-art, ultra-sensitive, capable of capturing a whisper from 40 feet away. Jake had calibrated every one of them the night before. Now he double-checked levels as the delegates began to file in, exchanging pleasantries in French, English, and Gulf-accented Arabic. Then Sheikh Abdul Rahman entered. The hum of conversation dimmed immediately. He took his seat at the head of the table without greeting or flourish, his hands folded before him. After a long pause, he began to speak, not in modern standard Arabic, nor any of the dialects commonly heard in the UAE, but in Hadrami. Jake froze. It was an old dialect, spoken mostly in the southern highlands of Yemen, where time seemed to move slower and stories were still told by firelight. Lena's mother had spoken it. Jake had spent months trying to understand its nuances back when he was stationed overseas. He knew it wasn't taught in universities. You had to live it, feel it. And that's why the Sheikh chose it. "No one in this room understands us," he said, voice low but certain. "So we will speak plainly." Jake could hear every word through his headset, each syllable perfectly preserved. His heart began to pound. The Sheikh continued, voice measured, authoritative. "The Americans and Iranians are watching the border fields. Too many eyes. If we move now, we risk conflict. But if we wait, we lose the window. Our partners in Ankara suggest a silent stake through shell companies. But that requires silence. Total silence." There were murmurs around the table. A few attendees looked confused. Most simply nodded, pretending they understood. The official interpreter, a middle-aged Lebanese man with a nervous habit of tapping his pen, sat frozen. Jake wiped a hand over his jaw, breathing slow. The implications were clear. They were discussing illegal acquisitions, energy resources buried in disputed territory. A move like that, if uncovered, could unravel diplomatic relations across 3 continents. Worse, if misinterpreted, if translated poorly, it could ignite real violence. He adjusted the gain on the receiver and looked around. No one else had reacted. No one had stepped in. Not even the interpreter, because no one else understood. Jake considered standing up, saying something, even a subtle gesture, but a voice in his head, his old commanding officers, held him back. "You're not here as a soldier. You're not the mission anymore." He was a technician, a father, a man who told stories, not exposed scandals. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling. Behind him, the control panel flickered. One of the receiver lines was peaking. He turned the dial slightly to compensate, just enough to maintain clarity without drawing attention. His hand trembled, almost imperceptibly. The Sheikh leaned forward, tone sharpening. "If anyone is recording, they must be dealt with." Jake swallowed. For a moment he felt the full weight of where he was, not just geographically, but morally. He remembered the night in Baghdad, when a mistranslation cost 2 civilian lives. He remembered Lena's tears when she learned of it. "Words matter more than bullets," she had whispered. Now here he was again, surrounded by men whose words could redraw borders and bury truth under money and marble. And he was the only one who understood them. Audio's clean. The voice startled him. Kieran standing just behind the booth, sipping a glass of mineral water he hadn't earned. Jake nodded, masking his tension. "Levels stable. Feed secure." Kieran glanced toward the room, narrowing his eyes. "You can't understand any of this, right?" Jake looked at him. "No, sir," he said evenly. Kieran sipped. "Good. Last thing we need is a janitor thinking he's a diplomat." Jake didn't correct him. He simply turned back to his console and focused on the blinking LED lights, each one a metronome of words that no one else could hear. Back in his room that night, Jake sat without turning on the light. He didn't call Lily. Not yet. Instead, he opened his notebook and scribbled down everything he remembered. Not just the words, the tone, the intent, the pauses between sentences that often said more than the sentences themselves. He needed to document it, not for evidence, not for vengeance, but for clarity. Because if something happened, if this spiraled into something ugly, he wanted Lily to know that her father had heard it coming, that he hadn't just stood by. He stared at Lena's photo beside the lamp. "What would you have done?" he whispered. She didn't answer, of course. But Jake remembered her last words in that same old dialect. "Don't just listen to understand. Listen to care." He closed the notebook and finally reached for his phone. "Daddy," Lily answered, breathless. Jake's voice cracked. "Hey, sweet pea," he said. "You up for a story tonight?" "Always." And as he opened the pages, translating a tale about a desert wind that carried secrets between villages, Jake reminded himself, sometimes the hardest thing a man can do is say nothing, and sometimes silence is the only thing standing between peace and ruin. The morning after the secret meeting, the Grand Salon buzzed again, this time not with whispered deals, but with frantic logistics. Staff moved like a ballet troupe in crisis, shifting chairs, testing projectors, reviewing place cards. A new wave of delegates was arriving for a broader economic roundtable. It was a more public-facing event, still exclusive, but less covert. Jake Sullivan had been called back to calibrate the audio system again. This time he worked out in the open, crouched near the central control station beside the floral arrangement that had its own event coordinator. He had his headset on, half listening to microphone feedback, half lost in his own thoughts. He hadn't told anyone what he'd heard the night before. Not the general manager, not the embassy contact whose card he still kept tucked behind his license, not even Lily. It weighed on him, but war had taught him this. Timing was everything. You didn't fire until the shot mattered. So he waited and watched and listened. As he adjusted the gain on the lapel mics for the guest speakers, Jake found himself quietly repeating a Hadrami proverb under his breath, as if tasting it. "If you sit long enough by the well, the truth will draw its own water." He whispered it slowly, honoring the sounds, letting them settle in the rhythm of his voice. But someone heard him. "Excuse me, what did you just say?" Jake looked up. One of the Sheikh's senior advisors, a thin man in a tailored navy suit, impeccably shaven with eyes like glass, stood a few feet away, arms crossed. Jake blinked. "Pardon?" "You just recited something," the man pressed, stepping closer. "In Hadrami Arabic." Jake straightened, taking off his headset. "Just a phrase, nothing important." The advisor's expression didn't change. "Do you speak Hadrami?" Jake hesitated. "Not fluently. But you understand it. Enough to be careful." The tension thickened like heat before a storm. "Where did you learn it?" the advisor asked, voice low but sharp. Jake's jaw flexed. "My late wife," he said. "She was Yemeni. Taught me what mattered." The man gave a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Wait here." Jake watched him retreat toward the side of the ballroom, where Sheikh Abdul Rahman stood surrounded by aides. Their conversation was private, quiet, but the advisor leaned in and gestured toward Jake, then said something short and final. The Sheikh's gaze shifted. For the first time, those eyes, dark, regal, heavy with the weight of empires, landed on Jake. Then he nodded once. The advisor returned. "The Sheikh wishes to speak with you." Jake exhaled slowly. He packed his tools with calm hands, slid his notebook into his back pocket, and followed. The meeting space had changed again. Now set for a smaller, high-level discussion, the center table was surrounded by only 6 men, the Sheikh at the head. The air was still, expectant. Jake was escorted to a standing position about 10 feet from the table. The sheikh didn't waste time. You recited a Hadrami proverb, he said, speaking in Arabic, but slowly, with deliberate diction. Jake answered in the same tongue, the words soft but sure. Yes, Your Excellency. A flicker of something, amusement perhaps, crossed the sheikh's features. Repeat this, he said, and then continued with a long, intricate phrase in Hadrami. It was a riddle, laced with metaphor, the kind of thing a tribal elder might say at a fire gathering to measure a young man's wisdom. Jake didn't flinch. He bowed his head briefly, as though offering respect to the words themselves, then raised his gaze and answered. Fluently. Clearly. The room went silent. The sheikh leaned back, fingers steepled beneath his chin. One of the other men dropped his pen. Jake stood straight, his posture relaxed, but grounded. He wasn't challenging anyone. He wasn't performing. He was simply answering. The sheikh spoke again, this time in English. You're American. Yes, sir. Military. Former, Jake replied. Linguist. Honorably discharged. And you chose to work here? Jake shrugged slightly. It's quiet. Mostly. And your wife? She passed 5 years ago. Cancer. The sheikh's expression shifted. There was a beat of silence. Jake added, voice low. I learned Hadrami not for war, but for her. To speak her language. To tell our daughter the same stories she grew up with. The silence deepened. Not uncomfortable, but reverent. The sheikh's voice lowered. Most men learn languages for business. You learned it for love. Jake didn't speak. He didn't need to. Behind him, one of the junior aides scoffed under his breath. It could be rehearsed. A performance. The sheikh raised a hand, silencing the room. He studied Jake, gaze probing, but not hostile. Would you recognize this? He asked, then recited the opening verse of a lullaby from the Al-Harif tribe, a folk song nearly extinct, passed from grandmother to granddaughter. Jake didn't hesitate. He closed his eyes, then sang. His voice was imperfect, weathered, not musical, but it carried weight. Memory. A quiet ache. He sang just the first verse, ending with a slight catch in his throat. When he opened his eyes, the sheikh was no longer leaning back. He had leaned forward, elbows on the table, watching Jake like a man who'd just seen a ghost. One of the older men at the table nodded slowly. My mother sang that to me, he murmured. Jake looked at him, not as a stranger, but as a man remembering the same fire, the same night sky, from different corners of the world. The sheikh stood. Your name? He asked. Jake Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, the sheikh said, his tone now formal but warm. Thank you. Jake bowed slightly. I only answered because you asked. The sheikh smiled, just enough to be felt. I believe, he said, you were meant to be in this room. For a moment, no one in the room spoke. Jake stood with both hands calmly at his sides, eyes steady, not proud, just present. The weight of the silence wasn't oppressive. It was reflective, like the pause after a beautiful piece of music before the applause dares begin. Something had shifted, not just the air, not just the perception of a man in a technician's uniform, but the way these men saw themselves. Sheikh Abdurrahman rested both palms on the polished wood table, his eyes never leaving Jake's. His voice, when he spoke again, had dropped in tone, less commanding now, more curious. Where did you learn to speak Hadrami like that? Jake reached into the chest pocket of his uniform slowly, carefully, like handling something fragile. From within, he pulled out a photo, creased, soft around the edges, well handled. He held it out for the sheikh to see. It was a candid image, a woman with long dark hair, tied loosely, standing beneath a fig tree. The sunlight in the background made her eyes glow even in the printed photo. Her laughter had been caught mid-moment, her hands in motion as if she'd just told a story, and was waiting to see if her audience believed it. "My wife," Jake said. "Lena." The Sheikh took the photo, studied it with a kind of reverence, then passed it to the older general seated beside him. "She was Yemeni?" the general asked. Jake nodded. "Born in Hadramaut, moved to the US when she was a teenager. We met at a language training center. I was the student. She was the instructor." That drew a few raised eyebrows. "She didn't just teach me to speak," Jake said, voice softening. "She taught me to listen." The Sheikh's gaze was distant for a moment, as if revisiting someone from his own past. Then, with deliberate gentleness, he asked, "Why did you continue learning after she passed?" Jake returned the photo to his pocket, pressing it flat with practiced care. "For my daughter," he said. "Lily's 9. Half of her blood, half of her stories, come from a language most of the world doesn't bother to understand anymore. But she deserves to know them. So I learn, so I can tell them. Every night." The room was quiet again, but it was no longer silence born of surprise. It was something closer to respect. Then the general leaned forward. His face was weathered, lined with decades of both diplomacy and war. He squinted at Jake with growing recognition, then suddenly snapped his fingers and pointed, not rudely, but with conviction. "You were in Ankara, June 2016. Jake tilted his head only slightly. "I was." "You were the one. Grey Whisper, they called you. You translated the entire summit between 5 delegations without a single error. You broke the coded misfire between the Turkish and Kurdish generals before it escalated. I was there." Jake's jaw tensed, the line of his shoulders stiffening. "I don't use that name anymore." The room stirred. Grey Whisper. It was a code name that had circulated in military and intelligence circles. A myth to some, a hero to others. A man who could hear 3 conversations in 3 dialects at once and separate them like threads on a loom. But he had disappeared years ago. Rumor had it he'd left the service after a personal tragedy. Few knew the full story. Now he stood in front of them, wearing scuffed work boots and a hotel ID badge. "You saved lives," the general said, not as praise, but as a record. "We were minutes from disaster. You heard the tone shift before any of us knew what was happening." Jake didn't respond. His eyes dropped for a beat. "I did my job." The Sheikh raised a brow. "And now that man is fixing hotel sound systems." Jake didn't flinch. "The systems still need fixing, and the work's honest." A younger aide scoffed. "You could be a diplomat, a strategist. Why would you choose this?" Jake looked at him, expression unreadable. "Because when I leave here at night, I'm not carrying the weight of other men's decisions. I get to call my daughter, tell her stories in her mother's voice, and sleep without needing to justify the cost of my silence." The room was stunned into stillness again, not from theatricality, but because the truth in his words left no room for rebuttal. The Sheikh slowly walked around the table, approaching Jake directly. They stood only a few feet apart now. The difference in attire was stark. One in flowing white robes edged in gold, the other in a grey technician's uniform with a name patch peeling at the corners. But in that moment, they were 2 fathers. 2 men who understood that legacy wasn't measured in titles or wealth, but in what you passed down when the world had stopped applauding. "She would be proud of you," the Sheikh said quietly. "Both of them." Jake said nothing. Then, more formally, the Sheikh added, "There may come a time soon where a voice like yours is needed again, not because you were Grey Whisper, but because you are Jake Sullivan." Jake nodded once. "If that time comes, I'll listen. I always do." The Sheikh returned to his seat, but the dynamic had changed. Jake was no longer invisible. He was no longer background. He was, unmistakably, seen. That night, as Lily climbed into bed on the other side of the world, Jake called her earlier than usual. "Daddy," she squealed, "can we do 2 stories tonight?" Jake smiled. "Yeah, Peanut. I think we can do 2. Something with a smart girl and a stubborn king." Jake flipped open the notebook. He found the story Lena used to love, a tale of a clever village girl who tricked a ruler into planting trees across a desert. "Ready?" "Ready." And as Jake began to read, a voice half from memory, half from the heart, echoed through the small room, across oceans and into a child's dreams. Respect is a fragile thing in rooms filled with power. It flickers, shifts, gets traded and tested like currency. And even when it's earned, there will always be one voice that tries to take it away. Jake Sullivan had just stepped out of anonymity, not by design. He'd only answered when asked. But the moment he spoke that Hadrami proverb and sang a verse of a lullaby long forgotten by most of the modern world, the room changed. For some, it changed in admiration. For others, in unease. One of the youngest aides, a man barely out of his 20s, all confidence and no character, cleared his throat and leaned forward, hands folded tightly. "Your Excellency," he said in Arabic, his voice polite but cold. "I mean no offense, but a few borrowed phrases and rehearsed lines don't prove fluency. Anyone with a good ear and YouTube can mimic a dialect." The Sheikh did not reply. The aide turned to Jake, his lips curling slightly. "If he truly lived the language," he continued, "then perhaps he can sing the Nahwa al-Qalb, the Heart's Lament, a folk song known only to the women of the Al-Harif tribe." The general at the table shifted, his expression hardened. "That's not a test," he said. "That's a memory. You don't test someone on memory." But the room was already holding its breath. Jake looked at the young man, clearly eager to reclaim some semblance of control, and said nothing. He didn't look offended. He didn't even look surprised. Instead, he reached into his back pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped through a folder labeled simply, "Lena." He found the file almost immediately. The Sheikh raised an eyebrow. "You have a recording?" Jake nodded. "She sang this to Lily, almost every night." He tapped play. At first the room only heard the faint scratch of the recording. The quality wasn't perfect. It had been recorded casually, late at night, on an old phone. But the voice that came through was clear, warm, untrained, but full of life. Lena, her voice wove through the air like smoke, fragile, floating, haunting. The lyrics were in a dialect so old, so textured, that most in the room had never heard it sung aloud. She sang not with technique, but with truth. And as her voice faded, Jake stepped in. He didn't try to impress. He didn't raise his volume. He didn't perform. He just remembered. He sang the next verse in harmony with his wife's memory. His voice was rougher, unpolished, but it carried weight. A weight born not of talent, but of love, of grief, of presence. For a few long seconds, the room was no longer the grand salon of Al-Qamar. It was a campfire in the Yemeni highlands. It was a quiet home in San Diego, where a child once fell asleep between her parents. It was a bridge between the dead and the living, between cultures and conflict. Then a sound broke the silence. Not a cough, not a phone. It was a sob. From the far back corner of the room, just past the catering service entrance, a tray of glasses clattered to the floor. A stocky man in a white apron stood frozen, his eyes glassy, a cloth still in his hand. No one had noticed him until now. The hotel's head chef, Mr. Bakri. He had been listening from the doorway, half hidden, like a ghost. "My mother," he whispered in Arabic, voice cracking. "She used to sing that when I was sick." All eyes turned to him. The tension in the room shifted again, not toward embarrassment, but toward reverence. Jake lowered his phone and stepped back. Mr. Bakri walked slowly into the room, ignoring the aides, ignoring the Sheikh, until he stood directly in front of Jake. He didn't speak right away. Then, in a voice thick with emotion, he said, "You brought her back for a moment." "Thank you." Jake nodded, and for the first time, the stoic technician blinked away something more than dust from his eyes. The Sheikh stood. No one had to be told to follow. "I think we have heard enough," he said, voice calm, layered with finality. But then he added, looking directly at the young aide, "Some songs are not for display. They are lived. You do not challenge a man to reveal his grief just to satisfy your doubt." The aide looked down. "Properly." Then the Sheikh turned to Jake again. "I would like you to join me in Geneva, not just to interpret, but to guide. I have seen more wisdom in your restraint than in many men's speeches." Jake took a moment before replying. "Your Excellency," he said gently, "I'm not a diplomat." The Sheikh smiled. "No, but you are a man who listens, and the world needs more of those." Later that night, in his room lit only by the soft yellow glow of his desk lamp, Jake sat on the edge of the bed. He didn't call Lily immediately. Instead, he replayed the recording again, Lena's voice, so he could hear it one more time before telling his daughter the story behind the song. He stared at the ceiling, feeling everything he thought he'd buried, slowly rising like tidewater. Then he called, "Daddy." Lily's voice lifted the room. "Hey, sweet pea," he said, smiling. "Want to hear something special tonight?" "More special than yesterday," he laughed. This one might be the most special of all." And then, with the phone close to his heart, he told her the story of a song, how it traveled from a mountain tribe to a mother's lullaby, to the walls of a palace, and now into the ears of a little girl who would carry it into the future. 2 days had passed since the Sheikh made his offer. The official letter arrived that morning, hand-delivered by a man in a dark suit with an accent Jake couldn't place. Embossed seal, silk envelope, no preamble. It was not a request. It was an invitation steeped in dignity, addressed not to Technician Jake Sullivan, but to Mr. Jacob Sullivan, linguistic and cultural specialist. At the bottom, in thick black ink, was a signature written in both Arabic and English. Sheikh Abdulrahman Al-Farisi, Peace Summit Delegate, Geneva, 2025. Jake held the letter for a long time, not because he didn't understand what it meant. He understood it too well. To anyone else, this would be a miracle, a second chance, the kind of offer that altered lives, changed trajectories, etched your name into history books. To Jake, it felt like a knock on a door he'd locked years ago, one he'd hoped would stay closed. Geneva. He'd been there once before, not as a guest of peace, but as a ghost in the walls of conflict, translating words between people who never truly listened, carrying messages that felt like countdowns in disguise. He placed the letter on the table and didn't pick it up again. By evening, the hotel had returned to its glittering rhythm. The Sheikh and his entourage had checked out, leaving behind silence and whispered rumors. But Jake had stayed. He wasn't part of the political machinery. He still had cables to run, frequencies to calibrate, things to fix that didn't involve borders or headlines. That night, he didn't eat dinner. He didn't read. He didn't reach for his notebook. He sat by the window of his small room, the skyline of Dubai gleaming like a city built on dreams, and stared at the letter lying unopened on the desk beside him. Even without looking, he could feel the weight of it. His phone rang at 9:02 p.m., as it did every night, the one constant in a world full of variables. Jake answered with a forced lightness. "Hey, Peanut." Lily's voice came through, cheerful as always. "Hi, Daddy. You sound tired." He smiled softly. "Long day. You didn't forget, right? You promised me a story. I've been waiting with my bear for 20 minutes. Jake chuckled. Poor bear. His name is Amar now, Lily said proudly. I named him after your story yesterday. Jake blinked. You remember that name? Of course. He was the smart camel herder who saved the Sultan's life. Jake leaned back. Right, of course. There was a pause on the other end, the kind that always came before Lily asked something that mattered. Daddy, where's Geneva? Jake rubbed his temple. It's a city in Switzerland, very far from here. Is it cold? Sometimes. Are you going? The question landed like a stone. Jake hesitated. I don't know. You told me they need help, she said. People arguing. You said someone has to make sure they listen. I did say that. Then why wouldn't you go? Jake didn't answer right away. There were a dozen answers, none of them honest. He could say he was tired, that he didn't trust the system, that the world didn't need another man trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. But then she asked the one thing he couldn't deflect. Can you tell stories in Geneva? He froze. What do you mean? Lily's voice softened. You said the stories you tell me, the ones Mommy used to read. They teach people to be kind, to think, to see people better. Can you tell some of those stories to the people in Geneva? Maybe they need to hear her voice too. The room went still. Jake's throat tightened. He turned toward the window, blinking against the lights. She said it so simply, so purely, as if the solution was obvious, as if peace could be stitched together with parables and proverbs and lullabies sung in the right tongue. And maybe, just maybe, she was right. He looked at the envelope again. It hadn't moved, but it had grown heavier. Not with pressure, but with purpose. Daddy, Lily whispered. He cleared his throat. Yeah, sweet pea. I think Mommy would go, she said. And I think she'd take me. Jake smiled, even his tears threatened. Yeah, I think you're right. The next morning, he called Kieran and handed in his resignation. Kieran blinked, genuinely baffled. You're quitting. You've been here for 3 years, Jake. You never asked for a raise, never took a sick day, never even ate at the employee lounge. Jake smiled politely. Guess it's time I started asking for a little more. He packed in less than an hour. Just 2 bags, one with clothes, the other with books, and his old military translator badge. He left the notebook where it had always been, inside his breast pocket, close to the hut. At the airport, as he waited for his boarding call, he sent Lily a message. Heading to Geneva. We'll tell you everything. Story time tonight might come from a different time zone. Love you more than all the desert stars. On the plane, he didn't open the letter again. He didn't need to. His daughter's voice had already rewritten it in a language more powerful than diplomacy. The language of love. Of legacy. Of choosing to step forward not because you have to, but because someone small and wise asked you to. Geneva was cold. Not the biting cold of cruelty, but the kind that lingered quietly in the air like memory. Soft, ancient, and persistent. Jake Sullivan stepped out of the black car that had picked him up from the airport and stared at the building before him. Modern glass curves fused with old stone bones. It was the kind of architecture that tried to remind the world peace was both tradition and innovation. Inside, the World Mediation Forum buzzed with restrained urgency. Delegates from 12 nations had arrived. Every handshake was weighted, every glance calibrated. Jake moved through the security gate with no entourage, no assistant, no tailored coat. Just a notebook, a translator badge from years ago, and a scarf Lily had knitted in uneven loops. Mr. Sullivan, a woman greeted him in crisp English. She was young, sharp-eyed, dressed in a tailored suit. The Sheikh has prepared a seat for you at the strategic dialogue table. Jake nodded. Is there a dress code I've broken yet? She smiled with diplomatic restraint. Not one that matters to him. The table was a long crescent of polished wood, ringed with ministers, advisors, and political strategists. Tablets glowed in front of them. Simultaneous interpreters sat in glass booths along the wall. Jake took the only open seat at the curved center. No one looked at him directly. Most didn't know who he was. But the Sheikh did. He offered Jake a respectful nod, nothing grandiose. Just a man acknowledging another man who had earned his place. A Moroccan official leaned over to a French diplomat and whispered something in fast, clipped French. Jake caught it without trying. "Is he one of ours?" The Frenchman shrugged. "Looks like a fixer. Americans love mysterious fixers." Jake said nothing. He didn't need to. The discussion began slowly. Trade routes, energy corridors, security concerns. For a while Jake simply listened, his ears working faster than his mouth ever could. Languages swirled around him. Arabic, French, Turkish, Dari, a bit of English. Words crossed swords beneath layers of smiles, accusations veiled as metaphors, threats masked as fiscal caution. Then came the knot. It was small at first, a debate over terminology, a phrase used by the Iranian delegate that the Saudi minister interpreted as a veiled threat. The Iranians snapped back with indignation. The Israeli aide stiffened. The Algerian advisor took the opportunity to pivot toward maritime leverage. Within 5 minutes, the air felt less like diplomacy and more like the slow rolling of thunder. Jake closed his eyes for half a second. He recognized this rhythm. It was the same tempo that once led to gunfire outside Fallujah, the same silent acceleration he had heard in Ankara before the mistranslation that nearly burned a treaty to ash. Words weren't just weapons. They were wires, and someone was about to trip them. He leaned slightly toward the Sheikh, speaking low. "Permission to speak?" The Sheikh nodded once. "Do." Jake cleared his throat, then gently placed both palms on the table, not to demand attention, but to ground his presence. "If I may," he said calmly, "I believe we're all saying the same thing, just not in the same way." The Iranian raised an eyebrow. "And who are you, exactly?" Jake didn't bristle. "A father, a technician, a listener." A pause. Then, still in Arabic, Jake continued. "When the falcon circles the valley, the sparrows do not argue about the wind. They wait until they understand its wings." The room stilled. A few delegates turned to their aides. Some typed furiously into translation apps. Others simply blinked. Jake smiled faintly. "It's a proverb. Al-Harif dialect. It means, before assuming threat, try understanding movement." The Saudi minister leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "You know that tribe?" Jake nodded once. "I do." The Israeli advisor smirked. "And you think a proverb will calm 30 years of suspicion?" Jake looked him straight in the eye. "I'm not here to calm anyone. I'm here to help you hear each other. I'm not speaking to win. I'm speaking so you understand one another." The table quieted, not out of agreement, but out of awareness. The Sheikh folded his hands. "Mr. Sullivan, would you be willing to moderate the rest of this session?" Jake hesitated. "Only if everyone agrees." There were glances, murmurs, small shrugs. The Iranian delegate gave a reluctant nod. The Israeli waved a hand. "Why not? Let's see what the poet can do." For the next hour, Jake translated, not just the words, but the emotions beneath them. He slowed the tempo, clarified metaphors, reframed accusations into inquiries. He didn't spin, he didn't manipulate. He simply realigned frequencies until meaning found its shape. He was not the loudest voice, not the smartest in the room, but he was the clearest. And sometimes, that's what changes everything. When the session broke for lunch, no one clapped. There were no backpats, no photo ops. But the Saudi and Iranian aides sat at adjacent tables. The Moroccan official asked Jake where he'd learned to draw me, and the young woman who escorted him earlier whispered, "That was surgical." Jake simply said, "It's not surgery, it's storytelling." The truth always knows where to land. That night, in his Geneva hotel room, Jake opened his phone. A new message from Lily. "Hi, Daddy. I told my teacher you're in Geneva telling stories so people stop fighting. She said that's even better than being an astronaut." "I agree. Love, Lily P.S. Can you tell me the Falcon story later?" Jake stared at the screen and smiled. Then he pulled out his notebook and added one more proverb beneath the others. "Sometimes the world doesn't need a hero. Just someone who listens until the anger turns into truth." The summit's third day dawned grey and windblown, the Geneva sky bruised with the threat of rain. Inside the marble and glass dome of the diplomatic hall, the mood was calmer than anyone expected. A deal, fragile but real, was taking shape. Jake Sullivan didn't sit at the table that morning. He stood off to the side, near the windows, quietly observing. His role, unofficial but undeniable, had already left its imprint. The tone of the dialogue had shifted. Delegates leaned in now when others spoke. They waited, asked follow-ups. Even the most cynical of the group began choosing words with more care, not to conceal, but to connect. Jake never announced himself, never corrected anyone who called him interpreter, or facilitator, or the American technician. He simply nodded, took notes, clarified when asked. If anyone noticed that the most powerful men in the room looked to him for nuance, they didn't say so. He preferred it that way. It was during a short coffee break that it happened. The delegates had retreated to the adjoining lounge, a cathedral-like space of echoing conversation and clinking porcelain. Jake stood at the far end, sipping dark Turkish coffee from a delicate glass cup, savoring a moment of stillness. That's when he saw the young man, late 20s, tie slightly askew, press badge swinging from a lanyard that read, "International Observer. Media Pool Access." The journalist approached with a practiced mix of confidence and reverence. He held a recorder in one hand, a notebook in the other. "Mr. Sullivan?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "Depends who's asking." The young man offered a nervous smile. "Elias Koenig, freelance for the Herald-Post. Mind if I ask you a quick question?" Jake glanced at the badge, then the recorder. "Only if it's really a question, and not an angle." Elias swallowed, clearly not expecting resistance. "It's just," he paused, adjusting his glasses, "you're not listed as part of any delegation. No titles, no official role. But yesterday, you bridged the standoff over water rights in under 20 minutes. And today, I overheard the Algerian team refer to you as a story priest." Jake huffed a quiet laugh. "That's a new one." Elias stepped closer, lowering his voice. "So, with all due respect, how does a hotel technician from Dubai end up guiding conversations between world leaders?" The question landed without pretense. It wasn't mocking. It wasn't even skeptical. Just honest. Human. Jake looked past the young man toward the main floor, where conversations resumed, slow and cautious. He could have said so many things, about his military background, about years in intelligence briefings, about fluent certifications and mission clearances stamped in red ink. But instead, he answered simply, "By listening to the people I love." Elias blinked. "That's it." Jake nodded. "That's everything." Just a few steps away, a young woman sat on a bench near the espresso cart. She wore a navy scarf wrapped tight over her shoulders, her notebook full of shorthand scribbles and highlighter smudges. A name badge hung from her neck. Leila Rahimi, Student Observer, UN Translation Program. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but when Jake spoke those words, she froze. By listening to the people I love, her breath caught. because she knew that voice. Not Jake's, but the woman's in his story. The accent, the cadence. She'd heard it on an old recording in her first-year dialect class at university. A sample of regional Yemeni lullabies, sung by a woman named Lena Sullivan. She'd listened to that voice dozens of times during exams. It had become a reference point for clarity, for warmth. And now the man who carried that voice's legacy was standing 10 feet away, speaking not about politics, but about love. Layla closed her eyes, trying to blink away the sting, but the tears came anyway. Quiet, sudden, and entirely sincere. She wasn't crying for sorrow. She was crying because for the first time, she saw the thing they had told her was impossible. That words, spoken with care, could actually change something. Elias, still holding his recorder, paused. He noticed her. Jake noticed her too. Their eyes met. Layla stood, brushed her sleeve quickly, and approached with hesitant steps. "I'm sorry," she whispered, voice shaking. "I wasn't trying to interrupt." Jake smiled gently. "You didn't." She nodded, clearing her throat. I've studied Arabic my whole life. My professor said I was chasing a dead thread, that no one outside of old textbooks spoke Hadrami anymore. But yesterday, when you sang, I recognized your wife's voice. I heard her on a training reel. I memorized her cadence. She helped me pass my final." Jake's breath caught. "She'd be proud of that," he said softly. Layla pressed her notebook to her chest. "She already is. Through you." Elias looked between them, realizing the story he thought he came for was something else entirely. Jake gave Layla a small, respectful nod. Then he turned to Elias. "You want to write something," he said. Elias lifted the recorder. "If you'll let me." Jake sipped his coffee again. "Then write this down." He paused, then said slowly, "The world isn't short on intelligence, or power, or strategy. It's short on people who know how to hold silence long enough to hear what others truly mean. If you want peace, don't learn how to talk. Learn how to listen, especially to those who don't have a microphone." Elias's pen moved fast. Layla smiled through fresh tears. Jake looked down at his watch. "Speaking of microphones, I think it's almost time to make sure they haven't muted the delegate from Ankara again." As he turned to leave, Layla called softly, "Will you be speaking at the closing remarks?" Jake didn't stop walking, but his voice floated back with a warmth that hung in the air like music. "Only if they forget how to listen." Jake Sullivan stepped off the plane into the familiar warmth of Dubai. It was late afternoon, and the golden haze of the desert sun blurred the edges of the tarmac. But this time, he didn't carry his technician's tool bag or wear his uniform with the company logo. There was no return-to-duty badge, no quiet nod to the concierge at the 7-star hotel. Because Jake wasn't going back, not to the tangled wires, not to the control room tucked behind velvet curtains, not to the space behind the stage where the world's wealthiest whispered into gold-plated microphones, barely noticing the man who made their voices clear. His time there was done. He moved into a quieter part of the city, a modest apartment not far from a park with peacocks and shade trees. He bought second-hand furniture, hung a photo of Lena near the reading corner, and stacked Lily's bedtime storybooks in a neat pile beside a soft lamp. He still called her every night. Only now, the stories he told had names she heard in the news. "Did they really listen to you, Daddy?" she'd asked one evening after school. Jake smiled. "Maybe. Or maybe they listened to your mom, through me." Lily giggled. "You're both pretty smart." He tapped his notebook gently. "I just remember the words. She made them matter." It wasn't until 2 weeks later that Jake's name started showing up again. Only this time, not in diplomatic files or intelligence reports. A local journalist from the Gulf Observer had attended the Geneva summit as a junior stringer. His piece, buried deep on the website under cultural commentary, began with a sentence no one expected. This is the story of a man who learned an ancient language, not for money, not for glory, not even for war. He learned it to tell bedtime stories to a little girl named Lily. The article described Jake's quiet presence, his pivotal role in translating Hadrami proverbs during the negotiation, and his refusal to take credit. It called him the listener. And the line that caught fire was a simple one. He is not a diplomat. He is a father. From there, the story spread like wind over sand. First in language blogs, then in regional papers, then international outlets picked it up. The Guardian, NPR, even a brief clip on Good Morning America, a photo of Jake sitting quietly in Geneva, wearing his simple sweater and scarf, looking more like a schoolteacher than a strategist, went viral on social media. But Jake didn't know any of that. He didn't check the news, didn't post. He still brewed coffee every morning and walked in the park. Still sat under the same tree to call Lily at 9 p.m. sharp. Back at the hotel, things had shifted. Technicians whispered stories of a code whisperer who once fixed a live mic with a piece of gum. The new hires heard about a ghost translator who'd made ministers cry without raising his voice. The head chef, an aging Lebanese man named Nabil, told his kitchen crew a story one evening as they cleaned up after a banquet. It wasn't about ingredients. It wasn't about recipes. It was about Jake. Nabil wiped his hands on a towel and leaned on the counter, his voice low. There was a man here, he said. An American. Quiet. Too quiet for a place like this. Always wore the same shoes. Always had a notebook. The younger sous chef raised an eyebrow. The guy with the bad coffee? The same, Nabil said, chuckling. But one day, this man, this ghost in the walls, was asked to speak. Not because he demanded it, because he understood something no one else did. And he didn't speak to impress. He spoke to connect. He said he learned Arabic to tell stories to his daughter. The kitchen fell silent. One of the youngest waiters, barely 20, leaned against the dish rack. Is that true? Nabil nodded. A journalist wrote about him. I printed the story. It's in the break room. Another waiter murmured, why would someone do that? Learn a whole language just to read bedtime stories. Nabil gave a tired smile. Because love teaches us better than ambition ever will. And with that, he turned off the lights and walked out of the kitchen. Elsewhere in the city, the story lived on in softer ways. A barista shared the article with her mother, saying, this is why I'm learning Farsi again. A young student from Syria bookmarked the quote. He is not a diplomat. He is a father. She read it every time she felt like giving up. And a translator in training in Cairo rewrote her thesis, changing its title to Listening as an Act of Love, the Sullivan Approach to Language Mediation. But the moment that struck deepest came weeks later, in the living room of a man named Karim. He'd once been the assistant head of security at the hotel where Jake worked. Tall, serious, usually skeptical of quiet types. Now, on a rare night off, he was sitting cross-legged on the floor, telling his 7-year-old son a bedtime story. It was about a man who fixed microphones for a living, a man who wore worn shoes and carried a notebook, a man who never raised his voice, but once, in a room full of powerful people, made them all stop and listen. And why did he learn all those words, Baba? His son asked sleepily. Karim smiled and touched the boy's cheek. Because he loved someone enough to understand her world. The boy yawned, eyes heavy. That's a good reason. It's the best reason, Karim said. Jake Sullivan never asked for recognition. He never needed it. Because his legacy didn't live in headlines or hashtags. It lived in voices, small and large, learning to speak more kindly. It lived in listeners, young and old, daring to pause before reacting. It lived in fathers telling stories, and in daughters who knew the power of their mother's language. And sometimes, the softest echoes are the ones that last the longest. The sun was soft and golden as it dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the Virginia hills. Late spring had painted the countryside in hues of honey and pine, and the air carried that gentle quiet only small towns in America seem to know, where even the bird song felt respectful, unhurried. Jake Sullivan stood beside his daughter at the crest of a grassy hill, the breeze tugging playfully at the ends of her sweater. Below them stretched a wide field, dotted with wildflowers, and the occasional patch of sunlight still stubbornly holding on. It had been 3 months since Geneva, 2 months since the article, 6 weeks since strangers had begun sending him handwritten letters from all over the world. Fathers, mothers, teachers, veterans, some in English, some in Arabic, some in both. But none of that mattered now, because today wasn't about the world. It was about her. Lily, 9 years old, legs swinging as she sat on a smooth rock. A faded hardcover book lay in her lap, its corners worn, its cover floral, its spine delicately mended with tape that had yellowed with time. On the first page, in soft cursive script, was a name: Lena Al-Rashid Sullivan. Jake had found it in a moving box labeled "Nursery, Do Not Throw." It had been Lena's favorite collection of folk tales, stories from Hadramaut and Sana'a, of clever orphans and wise camels, of laughing jinn and patient fishermen. Lena used to sing them. Then she read them to Lily. When she got too weak to read aloud, Jake had taken over. And now, here they were, on a hilltop, where the only sound was the rustling of grass, a page turning, and a child taking a breath to speak. "Baba," Lily said softly, eyes bright. "Can I read this time?" Jake looked down at her, taken aback by how much older she suddenly seemed. Not in height or size, but in posture, in the way she held the book with reverence, not playfulness. She had practiced this moment. He nodded slowly. "Of course," Lily smiled. Not the shy smile of uncertainty, but the wide, glowing one of a kid who knows she's about to fly. She opened to the first story, cleared her throat, and began. "Kana yama kana, fakadam al-zaman." Her voice was high and sweet. The Arabic came slowly, halting in places, but unmistakable. Jake listened as she stumbled on the guttural ein, self-corrected the rhythm of a line, and grinned through a mispronounced word that came out more like a sneeze than a phrase. She giggled. "I think I just said, camel sandwich," she muttered. Jake chuckled. "That's one lucky sandwich." She straightened, tried again. This time, the sentence flowed more smoothly, like water over stones. It wasn't perfect, but it was beautiful in all the ways that mattered. And Jake, listening with his hands folded over his knee, felt something shift deep inside his chest. Not sorrow, not pride, but a quiet, rising warmth. Not every inheritance is wealth. Some are languages, some are songs, some are the courage to try. Lily reached the end of the first paragraph and paused. "That was Mama's favorite part, right?" Jake nodded. She used to say it was the most important sentence in the book, because it meant anything was possible. Lily looked up at him, eyes wide with meaning. Like even a janitor at a hotel can be a hero. He smiled. Especially a janitor at a hotel. They'd laughed together, and for a moment it felt as if Lena were sitting right there with them, tucked into the wind, carried on the cadence of an ancient language told by the next generation. Lily turned the page, hesitated, then closed the book gently. "Baba? Yeah?" She stared out at the golden fields. "When I grow up, I want to help people listen too. not just talk. Like you did. Jake leaned back, exhaling slowly. You already are, kiddo. Every time you read those stories, you're helping someone remember how to hear. Lily looked at the book again. Can I write my own story someday? With Mama in it. But I'll add dragons. Maybe a talking teapot. Jake laughed. Only if the teapot speaks Hadrami. She looked up at him, mischievous. You'd better teach me more then. He ruffled her hair gently. Deal. Then Lily did something that caught Jake off guard. She held the book to her chest, stood tall on her little feet, and repeated one line, in Arabic, clearer than before. Al-Kalb yufhamo, ma la yakulu al-lisan. Jake blinked. She had tried to say, the heart understands what the tongue cannot say. The grammar was a little off. The rhythm wobbled. She pronounced kalb like kelb, which meant dog instead of heart. But her eyes, they glowed with such hope, such hunger to connect. Jake didn't correct her. He didn't need to. He just smiled, the kind of smile only a father could give after watching a daughter step into something bigger than herself. You just wrote the next chapter of your mother's book, he whispered. Lily beamed. They stood together as the sun finally slipped below the edge of the world, shadows lengthening across the hill like the final lines of a well-loved poem. No crowds, no microphones, just a girl with her mother's book, and a man who had once walked through fire to bring her voice across time. And as the breeze curled around them, carrying the scent of wild clover and warm earth, Jake closed his eyes and thought of all the words still left to share. Because the story was not over. It never really would be. Not as long as someone was willing to listen. Final message. Language isn't just for understanding one another. It's for keeping the ones we love alive in every story we tell. If you're still with us at this quiet moment after the story, I'd love to ask you something. Where in the world are you watching from? Maybe it's a busy city. Maybe it's a quiet porch in the countryside. Or maybe it's just a small corner of your day where you come to pause and breathe. Wherever you are. Thank you for being here. I truly mean that.